This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations.
We want families to come here and gain insightful strategies that empower them to successfully teach diverse learners at home.
Hosted by founder and CEO of SPED Homeschool, Peggy Ployer.
Our goal is that these powerful weekly conversations will boost your confidence to cultivate the best at-home learning environment for your student.
For more homeschool resources, go to spedhomeschool.com. You're listening to Empowering Homeschool Conversations with Peggy Ployer.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations. This month, we are focusing on high school and different transitions from high school to life afterwards. And so today, we are going to talk about creating successful student transitions using gap years. And my special guest today is Alana Kilmartin. Sorry, I was going to say your last name wrong, but welcome, Alana. I am super excited to have you here with us and to share about gap years, something that's definitely near and dear to my heart, and I know yours as well. So thank you for joining us today on the show. Are you able to hear us right now? We've got a little bit of lag time on the show. Looks like Learning Hub is here. Thanks for joining us. Are you there, Alana? Yeah, I can't hear you at all. So as we're getting started, if you are watching on YouTube, on Facebook, just know that you can put your comments, your questions in the feed. Like
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here, even though I am in a closet at the moment.
Yes. Well, welcome and thanks for joining us. And hopefully we'll be able to have this conversation and get some really great advice from you about gap years. I know
Hello?
it's, yep. Are you there? So as we're working on our reception here and video feed, just know that you can put your comments or your questions in the feed, and we would love to be able to. Hi, Alana. Are you able to hear us?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Hang on. I'm just going to try and move locations. It just seems to be not coming through clearly enough. Give me 2 seconds.
Okay, that's okay. Yep. So if you're watching live, hang on. We will cut this part out for the podcast. But just know that if you are watching, it looks like we're streaming to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, that you can put your comments, questions in the feed, and we would love for you to know what you have questions about, comments about gap years. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And we hope that this conversation will expand your understanding of what gap years are all about. All three of my kids ended up doing some sort of type of gap year. My oldest actually took a year to do welding before he went to college, and my middle child learned to play 2 different guitars, volunteered a lot for SPED Homeschool, and did a whole bunch of other work, and tried out some things during his year between high school and starting to work. And my daughter this year has been taking a gap year working at a retail place, as well as working as a receptionist before launching into college next year. So it's been something that I have found has been an extremely helpful thing for my students, especially students that tend to not know what they want to do, or maybe have some ideas but really want to flesh them out and need that extra year to do that. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this coming hour is those gap years. And Alana has a book called Unserious Careers. She also has a podcast, and she's going to be on soon, hopefully, to talk to us. So, so thank you, all of you. I see some people popping on to YouTube, and hi back. Glad to have you here. We are just waiting for our guest to show back up, and we'll start kind of from the beginning again once she's able to get some reception, as long as she is able to get reception. So yes, if you have any questions, comments, or anything for me, I would be happy to take those as well. So Alana is back, and we'll welcome her back to the show.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
The closet did not seem to be working very well.
Yeah, sometimes it's where you are and where your reception is. I definitely, your feed is much better where you're at. So
Perfect.
so let's start over again. And the live people, thank you for your patience with us. But I'm just gonna kick this off for our recording portion, and then we're just gonna dive in. So here we go. Today, we are going to talk about creating successful student transitions using gap years with my special guest, Alana Kilmartin. Thanks for joining us, Alana. I'm super excited to have you here and for you to share about gap years.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, as we're getting started, I always have my guests share a little bit about themselves and their background. And I would love for you to share just a little bit about yourself and why you are so passionate about gap years.
Oh, it's such a long story. I guess it's a bit of a love affair in its own way with gap years. But it really started, I guess, when I took my first gap year. So when I was 18, I finished high school. The first gap year came about because a boy broke up with me when I was 17 years old, which seems kind of silly, but it was kind of how it really went down.
Never know.
Hey, sometimes it's the craziest things. And I think it really started me questioning the idea of what else is out there, like what else could be possible for me in my career. I just thought I'd go down a more traditional career path. But really, it was that first gap year where it just kind of reframed my entire career, I think, and everything really changed from there. And I spent it overseas. So I did traveling for 3 months in the US and in Europe, and then lived in Italy for 9 months as an au pair. And it really kind of took all of those ideas I had about careers and went, cool, what ones do we actually want to follow? What do I want to believe in?
Yes.
And yeah, it really did change the entire direction of my career.
Yeah. And, you talk about careers, and I think, a lot of times, like students, like you said, and you turn 17, we have this kind of idea of a career, but we really don't know. And your website and you have a new book out and a podcast talk about unserious careers. So how essential do you see this gap year experience in informing those experiences, that training that can really be helpful for careers and paths post high school?
Yeah, so the book I wrote, so as you said, it's Unserious Careers. And what I've got in there is 11 actions that you can take for a less serious, more adventurous start to your career. So the book focuses on only the first 5 years of a person's career, pretty much once they finish either their traditional schooling or whether it be homeschooling, and they've kind of finished that, say, curriculum, and then they're going into that next phase of their life. And what I've really found through my own experiences and then through research with other people in their careers was that you don't know what you don't know. Right. And you have to kind of get out there and try careers, try different things to know if it's for you or not. And most of the time that looks like going down a prescribed career path, be that based on your potential, or it could be based on the area you live in, the access that you have to, say, further education. Right. There's so many different things that go into that. And I think what I'm very, very passionate about is how can you go out and experiment with the world? How can you go out and actually try things rather than feeling like you need to make a decision for your career in 10, 15 years, right when you're 17 or 18 years old and still only know a small percentage of what happens in the world. So one of those actions that I talk about is take a gap year, because I think what's so brilliant about a gap year, especially when you're 18, is that you are very intertwined with your parents, the environment you grew up in, the community, your schooling experience. And a gap year is this brilliant way, depending on what you do, to kind of create a bit of separation so that you as a young person can work out what's my idea and what's someone
Right.
else's idea that I've just had kind of, I guess, impressed upon me because of where I grew up. And yeah, I think it's arguably probably the most important action that I include in the book, because it just the potential is unlimited with what you can do with one. And I don't think there is an incorrect way to take a gap year. The main
Right.
thing is that you take one.
Yeah. Well, it really does flesh out what is truly yours, like you said, and it kind of gets rid of other people's ideals, and it again, it does go back again to that. How do you do it? And we're going to talk a lot about today about some advice that Alana has for you. If you have a student kind of going into this, I think I'm going to do a gap year, and like you said, there's no rights and wrongs, but there's probably lots of lessons learned that we definitely want to be able to give you some advice
For
and
sure.
walk you through
Absolutely.
and help out with that. So so yeah, but so what if we were to have a definition of a gap year? What would it be? And how can that differ from person to person? So let's think general definition first, and then maybe some examples of what that would look like for different types of people,
Mhm.
or ones that you've seen in the
Yeah,
past,
so I
maybe.
think that so like gap year for me is a term. It's not quite as like I'm in the States at the moment. I grew up in Australia, but gap year isn't as common, I've found, in say America as what it is in places like the United Kingdom,
Right.
Australia, and New Zealand,
Hmm.
where it's almost a rite of passage to take a gap year and, say, for example, go overseas for 12 months. Not that everyone does it that way. But I think really a gap year is, in the traditional sense, a period of time, generally 12 months, that's taken between schooling, like a high school, and then going on to further education, say, for example, university. That's kind of where, like, I think most people would understand what gap year means. But I think we
Yeah.
should really kind of broaden that definition to be essentially just a 12-month gap between one phase of your life and the next phase of your life, where you can go and
Right.
explore, you can go and experiment, and you can do something different. And the way I like to explain it, especially for a gap year, say that you do go and do after schooling, is it's like a peanut butter sandwich. So if you think about
I love
your
that.
school your schooling as being one piece of bread, and
Hmm.
whatever you do in your career the rest of your life being another piece of bread, you don't really
Hmm.
have much of a sandwich if you put the two pieces of bread together. But if you
Right.
put some peanut butter in the middle, you have this, and the peanut butter being the gap year, you have this really incredible glue between those two
Oh, that's
phases.
beautiful. Hmm.
And if you think about coming out of schooling, and even from like a homeschooling perspective, where you are in a certain routine, you have different habits, it can
Right.
look incredibly different what you do in that next phase of your life. And I think this is where a gap year just helps to smooth that transition out. And as an example, like I'm 30 at the moment, and I'm now technically on like an adult gap year. And so the reason why I'm taking that gap year now is because my partner and I had been living in New Zealand for nearly 5 years. And so we went, we're not sure if we want to be in New Zealand any longer, but we didn't know where that next place was. So it was kind of like New Zealand was one phase. We didn't know exactly what that next phase was going to be. So we're like, well, why don't we take a gap year where we do go and travel, we go and have some fun, we explore the world, and we can decide through that process of going on that next one. So I
Right.
think from a young person's perspective, say that is 17 or 18, often that gap year might look like taking that 12-month period off before university or before an apprenticeship, or it could be after university before entering the workforce, and be it traveling the world, going off backpacking. It could be working and saving money to go to university. It could be
Right.
volunteering. It could be so many different things. And I think that
Absolutely.
is where sometimes people get a bit maybe overwhelmed by the idea of a gap year,
Mm.
because it's like, well, how do I do it correctly for me?
Yes, yes, I think that's kind of the way we think. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, from what you're describing, it should take us out of that thinking process and allow that exploration to happen,
Mm,
and yeah, those connections to be made, and all of that
yeah.
that good stuff that we often dismiss as learning, but truly is at the core the best learning because it's experiential, and
Yeah.
that's the
And
things
it's
that tie things together.
For sure. And it's with I know I've noticed going through my 20s, there kind of is this like increasing social pressure. And even though it may not be someone directly saying to you, what are you doing with your life? There's like an
Right.
internalized pressure, I think, that you have from seeing what
Absolutely.
everyone else around you is doing. So it's
Right.
or that person bought a house, or that person went and got this job or this promotion. And I think this is where a gap year is this amazing time where no one expects you at 18 to know what you're doing with your life. It's kind of like one of this really beautiful grace period where you could be doing
Right.
anything and it
Yeah.
totally flies.
Mhm.
And that's where I love that time period for taking a gap year, because there's basically no risk but infinite reward on the table.
Yeah, yeah, because oftentimes you see students go into college and, 2 years in, 2 years into debt, and it's like, Why am I doing this? And do I really want this career, or is this even the path I'm supposed to take? And how much, more economical and probably wise to have taken that 1 year. It's 1 year, and it's not gonna ruin
No.
your life. It's actually gonna make it better. Just yeah, yeah, absolutely. So those are some
Yeah.
advantages of those gap years. Um, are there any specific students that you wouldn't recommend taking a gap year, or that you would recommend more so taking a gap year?
Yeah. One of my favorite things is through the process of writing the book, I did interview quite a lot of young people, and I would ask about gap years, and I'd say, did you take one? And then they'd say no, and I'd say, how come you didn't take one? And they'll like inevitably say something along the lines of, I was worried I wouldn't go to university if I didn't take a gap, if I did take a gap year. And
Okay.
it's controversial, but I actually don't think I think that that's kind of false, because I think
Mhm.
that if you weren't meant to go to university, what's the point in going to university? That if you are worried that
Yeah.
you weren't
Yeah.
going that was going to stop you from going, then maybe university wasn't right for you in the first place anyway.
Mhm.
And the only really good reason that I've had someone come up with, I think, for not taking a gap year was a scholarship. And sometimes there are scholarships
Oh,
attached to maybe a
yes.
university
Yeah.
placement
Mhm.
that most of them you could probably defer. But if that was
Mhm.
going to be the case where you had a free ride through a university, like a post schooling qualification, then of course that would make sense for you to go and do that. But I think it does also depend on the type of person. And the more important probably question is, what type of gap year do you want to take, as opposed to,
Oh,
do you
that's
want to take a
yes.
gap year? Because there's
Mhm.
a way of doing it depending on who you are as to what you can get out of it. And to me, it's just one of those things that it helps you to really understand what you value,
Mm,
and it
mhm.
will inform every decision in your career from there on. So, to be honest with you, most people will benefit from taking a gap year. The question just becomes, how do you want to take that gap year, and what's going to best serve you for you, your life, and your career?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have a personal story of my daughter this last year. She was pretty certain when she graduated from high school last year that she wanted to be a tattoo artist. And so we were pursuing that. She was creating her portfolio. And in the process of working during her gap year, she realized that physical work and she was diagnosed with something over this year, they didn't jive. It was not a career that she could physically do. And so it really made her go back and say, what can I do physically? What are my gifts? And what track do I want to take? And it has actually moved her towards college. and and the same thing
Mm.
happened with my oldest son, who went to welding school, wanted to be a welder, and came back and said, no, I think my brain needs to work more than my body. So, they just learn these things, and better for them to know that from their own experience than as a parent, me saying, well, this is a wiser choice. This is what you're better at. And they wouldn't be as invested in it
Mm.
if we came in from that
It's really
direction.
There's a really interesting thought I've been playing with, and it kind of like talks about a bit about what you're talking about there with your own children. That I think we have this very probably outdated view of career progression, and how what is career success. And it's kind of this say idea of, you get into a certain line of work, you work your way up, or you start to make more money, you get the promotions or whatever it is. And that's kind of seen as career progression. So, okay,
Right.
you have, say, graduated from university, you've then gone into a company, you've started as a graduate, and then 3 years later, you're a junior associate or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what I think happens. If you're making that traditional career progression at a career that you think is a really great fit for you originally, and you're like, this will get me everything that I want, it's a respectable job, people think I'd be good at it. What can often happen is you get to say your mid-20s and you've been doing it for a little while and you realize, is this all there is?
Right.
And what can happen
Absolutely.
is you go, well, now I kind of feel like I haven't made any progress, that I now have to start back at square one, which you never do in your
Right.
career. You're always making
No.
progress. You always take everything with you. But I think what can happen is a young person, I've seen it, so many people come into their mid-20s and they go, what do I do now? I'm so lost. But where I
Mm.
think that career progression really comes from and career success, it comes from being in total alignment with what you know that you want from your life, what you want to experience, how you want to feel on a daily basis, and then aligning your career to that. And for one person, that's going to look very different to the next person. But it's really only when you get clearer on what you want, mainly from your life, that you
Mm.
can then kind of reverse engineer your career to get you that. Whereas I think what kind of happens when we come out of when we are sort of 18 is we end up engineering our life based on our career, as opposed to going out there and experiencing life and going, well, how can I now build that career into that life so that I can make the money that I need to be able to fund whatever it is that I want to go and do? Because
Yeah.
otherwise, once again, you get to that mid-20s and you're like, well, I'm not doing the things I actually wanted to do. I don't have the time. I feel like a 40-year-old man in the middle of his career, you know?
Absolutely. And you don't like where you are. And that's why you see so many people drop out of what they went to school for at about that age that you're talking
Mm.
about, because it's not satisfying. It wasn't what you were promised. I mean, you're promised like you get this career and your life will be good, and then it's not. And we don't want to lead our kids down that path, or to lead to kind of feed them that lie, truthfully, that this is the end all be all. It's gonna provide everything that you need. But I love what you said about the provision and loving to do what you do. I mean, that really, in essence, that's what we need. We need to be able to
Mm.
provide for ourselves, and make an income, so we you know can can pay for our own needs and the needs of anybody dependent on us. Um, but but at the end of the day, do you find joy in what you do? And that's what feeds you, or feeds
Mm.
our soul, is about, this is what feeds me back. Because we can give
Mm.
and give and give, and it'll just work us to the grave. And then our life will only be about what, everybody told us it was supposed to be about. And that's a sad
Mm.
end. That's
That's, yeah, that's like the idea of even like the idea behind the name of unserious careers, just for a bit of background into that in case
Mhm.
someone's wondering, like, what do you mean by unserious careers, is for me an unserious career is a career where you actually prioritize your daily lived experience of work. And I think we kind of get into this mentality as young people because we're trying to get ahead. We feel like we need to make a name for ourselves. Is we keep going for this will be better in a couple of years' time. Like this will pay off in a few years' time. Then I can start enjoying my life. But I think we really
Yeah.
need to start thinking about, am I enjoying this right now? Because the chances are, if I'm not enjoying it now, I'm probably not going to enjoy it in 2 years' time with that next promotion or that next whatever it may be, that next pay rise. And when you can start prioritizing that enjoyment, I just think you are much more likely to continue making better decisions that keep
Mhm.
building on the previous decision. Because that's all our career is, right? It's just a series of
Yeah,
decisions we've made of take this job, don't take this job, take that promotion, don't take that promotion, move to a
absolutely.
different city, don't move to a different city. But
Mhm.
when you are enjoying what you're doing, you're more likely, I believe, to attract opportunities that you're like, yes, this is what I want to do next. As
Right.
opposed to kind of being in I'm not really enjoying this. I'm going to look for anything to get out of this.
Right. Yeah. So in that same context, of looking at options and opportunities, what would a student do when they're looking at, okay, I've got a gap year ahead of me. What do I take advantage of? What do I do? And how
Mhm.
would you recommend that they approach that decision making process on what to choose and
Mm.
how to go about that.
Yeah, so it really depends on your experience of schooling up until that point. So there's some
Mm.
people that are totally exhausted by the time
Yes.
that they have got to the end of their schooling, and they don't want to go and do, say, more study or anything like that. Like they need a total like brain just reset. So I think
Yeah.
that if you're someone that's in that kind of camp, I think a gap year can't be overly stimulating, because you really do just need to give your body a chance to,
Right.
chill out, maybe
Yes.
work in a job that's not going to require too much brain
Mm-hmm.
capacity.
Right.
But I think there are many factors at play, and I'll give an example of where this is quite important. Let's say, for
Yeah.
example, you have an idea that you do want to go to university and that you want to go and study and get some sort of a qualification at that
Hmm.
level. And you've done the research and you know it's going to cost you X number of dollars, be that in living costs because you're moving away from home or through your
Mm-hmm.
tuition or whatever it may be. I hate to say it, but the money side has to come into it. So
Yes.
are your parents going to support you at university? Are you going to have that? Are they going to be able to help you out with rent or help you out with your tuition, whatever it may be? Because if
Hmm.
you're not receiving any financial assistance from your parents through that next phase, that next early phase of your life, a gap year then needs to be a bit more strategic. And it can be, okay,
Right.
well, how can I save up money during that time so that when I go to, say, university, or I move away from home, I'm not going to be really stressed because I
Mm.
can't even pay my bills.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a couple of kind of like key considerations there, that you can't just give one piece of advice of go travel for 12
Oh,
months
yeah.
because
Right.
people are in very different financial situations, of course.
Exactly.
But I mean, I always like to think of it as, what is something that you're really interested in that has really nothing to do with school? It has nothing to
Hmm.
do with your career. And can you build that into a gap year or create a gap year out of that? So an example for me with my gap year was I wanted to learn how to speak Italian fluently. I
Oh,
wanted the
wow.
experience of learning another language through living in another country.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, okay, well, how could I then go and spend an extended period of time in Italy? Okay, well, it's going to cost me a fair bit of money if I'm doing that and not working. So can I get a working holiday visa? Yes, I can. Right, what would I be able to organize before I go so that I know I have a job when I get there?
Hmm.
And that's kind of when the nannying piece came into it of, well, all of my costs will
Right.
be taken care of. I won't have accommodation costs. I won't have food costs. It'll just be I get like an allowance each week. And
Mm-hmm.
I think when you can kind of have something that you can pull on, and that could be something as simple as I've always wanted to learn how to surf, or I've always wanted to be able to dedicate time to reading a book a week or something like that. It
Mm-hmm.
could be anything big or small. I
Right.
think there has to be some degree of enjoyment in a gap year. And
Yeah.
as I said, you don't have to do the same, you don't have to do the same thing for the whole 12 months. It could be that you start off working for 6 months at the job that you had part-time during school, but that you then go full-time, and then spending
Right.
3 months overseas, and then spending 3 months doing something else. I think you've got to start somewhere. And I think
Hmm.
consider the financial ramifications of what you want to do in that next phase, but then also what's something that
Absolutely.
you enjoy and that you can pull that thread to see what you might be able to do with that.
Yeah, yeah, that's great advice because everybody is so different, and I never even thought about just that burnt out phase, and yes, and you really have to lean into that and know that it's okay to and you need that recovery time. I mean, mental health is such a big issue, and we don't, the schooling system creates a lot of those issues because of the pressure that we put on these kids. And I'm sorry to say, but homeschoolers, parents do it the same thing. I always hear from parents, how
Mm.
do I catch my child up? How do I get their grades better? And it's like we're putting pressure just by saying those things. And we don't realize that we're doing it. And we wonder why our kids are so stressed out. And then we're asking them, so what are you doing next year? And
Mhm.
it's all these things that I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing for my life. So
It
why
does
am I
live.
asking my kids?
You know, I think that's a really interesting point you bring up, and thank you for bringing that up around mental health, because there's so many options now. There are so many choices, and I think with that comes its own level of stress. It's not just go
Yeah.
become a teacher or a nurse or a doctor or an engineer or whatever it is. There are so
Right.
many specialties, there's so many things. There are so many ways that you can create a career or create a life.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, the mental health rates are higher than they've ever been, especially in young people. So we're not doing something right. Something's
Right.
not going right. So we kind of have to go, well, how can we do this differently? And that's where I do love I guess, the ethos behind homeschooling. But from what I have heard, there are still a lot of the same issues. And it's almost like I don't know if you use this phrase in America, but there's a bit of a chip on your shoulder. So
Oh,
it's almost like
yes.
you've got something to prove, because it's
Mhm.
like, well, I'm doing it differently. So now I need to
Right.
prove that either my child can be just as good, if not better, because they've been homeschooled. And I think
Mhm.
what's the kind of what's the purpose of it all? Like, what is
Right.
the purpose of school? What
Yeah.
is the purpose of a career? And I think that's where it's really on a young person to go and decide that for themselves, that a parent can't decide that for their child.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes.
Mm,
Because yeah, the influence only goes to our doors, and
mm,
I've seen my kids that have picked up those ideals and run with them because they really felt like the ideals that we raised them with were the basis of what they thought was the core of what they agreed with as far as their belief
mm,
systems. And it wasn't something that I hammered into them. And that's what
mm,
you really want. You want them to flesh it out. You want them to say, I do this because I want to do it. And
mm,
because I just find that this is in alignment with how I've seen truth, in my own life, and things work out. And yeah, there we all do it different, and I think like you said, it's how we try to portray this is a successful thing. Thankfully, homeschooling has taken a huge turn since COVID, and everybody
mm,
realized just, how much better a lot of it has worked for our kids just because they can go at their own pace. But unfortunately, we
mm.
do think of those averages and those other paces, and that makes it more difficult again.
Yeah, of
um,
course.
yeah. So, going into a gap year also, as far as setting boundaries,
Mhm,
um, whether it's a parent setting boundaries saying, you're allowed in my house. These are the rules that you have to play by now that you've graduated, or
yep.
even for a student to set boundaries for their own self. What are some recommendations that you have as far as just ways to make the gap year the most successful by providing those preset limitations, or I guess um, just definitive, maybe a timeline or anything
Mhm,
else that you've seen be helpful in that
mm.
process?
Yeah, so I think the this is a gap year is amazing because it does put a timeline on it. And I think that's actually really important, as opposed to it being, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm just going to go and try a bunch of stuff, which still
Right.
has its own benefits, don't get me wrong. But I think for the individual, but also for the family unit as well, it helps to know that there is a timeline line on it. And even if that means that you get to the end of that gap year and you're like, you know what, I'm going to take another one because I'm enjoying myself. I want to try something different. And then it just rolls into a career anyway, and that becomes your
Right.
life. But I think
Mhm.
that's what's brilliant about it, is you put that timeline on it and you go, I'm going to take 12 months to fill in the blank, whatever it is. But
Yeah.
where it really starts, I think, is a conversation. And
Mm.
when I think back now, I went to university, but when I think back now, I do not really recall having a proper conversation with my parents about the financial investment of university and what they would
Mm.
be able to support me with versus not, and what their expectations were. And I've found this to be the case with people that I've spoken to that are both in their teenage years and beyond, that it's actually not even clear, that communication between parent and child, about
Really?
what a
Mm.
parent is willing and able to provide and what a child expects maybe as well. And the communication, I think, is key, because at the end of the day,
Right.
just because you've turned 18 doesn't mean you're a fully fledged adult and you're totally independent and you don't need your parents. Let's be honest, like, it
Yeah.
takes a lot
Yep.
longer, that kind of, once again, transition, that separation. And I
Mhm.
think that is where it does start, just with that conversation to begin with. And I think there are a lot
Mm.
of parents out there, yourself, you would be one of these people, that you're you're an advocate for a gap year, but there are a lot of parents that still have hesitations
Right.
around gap years, believing, once again, kind of that idea of like, my child won't then go and do whatever it was, go to university, start an apprenticeship. But
Yeah.
that's kind of a bit of an outdated view on it based on probably their experiences when they were going through the
Right.
schooling system, or
Yes.
they've heard that story
Mhm.
of, oh, my child took a gap year and then they never went, and now they're whatever they're doing. So I
Right.
think if you can start with an open, honest conversation between parent and child, and that can be instigated by the parent, that could be instigated by the child, of just, this is what I'm thinking about doing. You don't have to justify it as a young person. You don't have to justify why you want to do it, because at the end of the day, you can make your own decisions. But in my experience, your life will be a lot smoother and a lot easier if you can have the support of your parents. That doesn't
Yeah.
have to mean financially, but if you can have the like the emotional and just the life support from your parents, so
Right.
that when maybe you are having a tough time in that gap year, or you need to problem solve something, or you're not really sure, you have people already in your court that can then come and help you with that and give you some advice or whatever it is, and not people that are going to say, I told you so, this is why you shouldn't have done this. So I
Right.
think that kind of conversation is really important. And it really, I think, helps even in the transition between that
Mhm.
parent-child dynamic and that kind of almost like equals, like you're now equals, like you've got a child, like,
Mhm.
my parents are always going to have a certain dynamic, of course, because they are my parents.
Right.
But I really believe it was through that kind of gaining my own independence on taking a gap year that we could have better conversations as parents and child as well.
Yes, it's so true. And yes, and we found that having that definite timeline as parents gave us that relief that they're not just going to be hanging around the house. And and there's some things that for my middle child especially, who tends to be more free floating, that was, I think, the biggest concern with me and my husband, was, what are you going to do with this year?
Mm,
And so he kind of gave us some ideas of what he wanted to explore. And so we kind of, we had that conversation back and forth of, this isn't just a year to hang around the house. And
mm,
so he actually taught himself how to play 2 different guitars, and he did some
amazing.
volunteer work, and he actually went to Russia with me. I spoke at a homeschool conference there, and so he was doing some volunteer work for our organization. And so yeah, got to see the world, and dive into music, which is his passion. and
Mm,
and then when the year came up, we said, okay, this month is coming. It's now time to start looking for a job, or if you haven't already, you get on it right now, because this is when it ends. and
yeah.
um and yeah, so if you're a parent listening to this and saying, I don't know, I've got this child that is just kind
Mhm,
of a free floater, just know that if you set those boundaries, if you feel like you have to have it in writing, put it in writing. I don't know if that
mm.
would be helpful, but yeah, it depends on your relationship with your child. But those have been it for us. It has helped all of our kids, and I thought they had pretty good high school careers too, and had
Mm.
learned a lot. But there was something above and beyond that, of going into that time.
Yeah,
So
I think there's I'm a really big advocate for, and it's actually one of the actions that I talk about in my book, which is just live somewhere else in those first 5 years after school.
yes.
And it goes naturally that a gap year is a perfect time to do that. And when I say live somewhere else, I don't mean that you have to uproot your entire life and move across the country or move to a different country. It just more means to go and experience what it's like to be in a different environment that isn't the one that you grew up in, that isn't necessarily under your parents' roof. So that can happen in your gap year, but it doesn't have to happen in your gap year. And I think when you do that, you open yourself up to a completely different perspective. Because
Hmm.
I grew up, say, for example, on a farm, and
Yeah.
it was probably an hour walk to the closest town. I would catch school buses to get to school, all that sort of stuff. My life was very different to someone that was raised in the city.
Right.
But
Yeah.
through me then visiting and living in the city, I got a whole new perspective of like, oh, not everyone is a farmer, not everyone is like something. You know what I
Right.
mean? There was
Yeah.
a lot of construction, a lot of trades, a lot more
Mhm.
manual labor where I grew up, and very, very little office related. There were of course offices, but
Yeah.
not compared to the city where you have a massive corporate contingency and following all the rest of it. And so
Yeah.
I think from a gap year perspective, it's also a really neat time that if you're unsure what to do, of how could I live somewhere else? Do I have a cousin that lives in a different state to me or in a different environment? Could I go and spend a month with them or something like that? Because I think when you
Right.
expose yourself to those different environments, it's really good for resiliency. And
Absolutely.
resiliency is something that is going to keep paying off in a person's career, because you're not always going to get everything that you want in your career. And that if you build up that kind of grit and resiliency, you start to take almost ownership back of your career and understand that, yes, while this person may be giving me a job, I can also choose to leave this job and go somewhere else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in addition to resiliency, I think it also gives us compassion and understanding of other people, because we
Mm,
always, when, we're raised, we tend to come from that perspective of, well, everybody thinks the way I do. Everybody, and we just don't even understand. Like you said at the beginning, we just don't know what we don't know.
mm,
And I found that even just through traveling abroad, is when you get immersed into these other cultures, you're like, oh, they do this different, like you
mhm.
go to Italy, like we were talking about before the broadcast. Lunch is an hour, 2 hour process. It is not a 15-minute, fast food
It's
type
an
of thing.
event.
And it's an event, yes, and it's in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
um, but we have to experience those things to really
Mm,
understand them. And so this
mm,
is a lot of what we're talking about is that getting out of that box of and even though you think maybe as a parent you've provided a good box for your child,
yeah.
that's good. It's a starting place, but they're going to have to live in the world, not just your
Mm.
box. And so these experiences are so essentially important to making them impactful for their life and their career. So I wanted to kind of just delve into a final question about these experiences lending into preparation for like transitioning to adulthood.
Mhm.
There's just so many things, and I think we often just think of careers, but what about life transitions? And what about this gap year experience can really change that whole dynamic?
I'll give you a very specific example from my gap year. Yeah. So I always loved, when I was growing up, I loved looking after like younger cousins, and I loved being around younger children. And it was probably part of the reason why I was like, you know what, I could go and be an au pair, like a live-in nanny with a family in Italy. And so I
Hmm.
spent 9 months with this family. There was I think a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, two boys.
Hmm.
And so I had studied Italian at school, so I did have a base understanding of Italian, but it was a very like baptism by fire. Very quickly had
Yeah.
to pick it up. So part of my role was to help teach the kids English. And it was a phenomenal experience for a lot of reasons, but I wouldn't have said that was a really happy time of my life, like while I was nannying, because it was very lonely a lot of the time. But
Yeah.
not to mention, I was looking after children. And I learned very quickly that it's fun to look after a child for 2 hours and play around. But it's a
Yes.
very different thing in the summer holidays, for example, for 3 months to be spending 10 hours every day with these children. But also the
Right.
fact that there was a slight language barrier. And I didn't have the same authority, I guess, for discipline. So I couldn't discipline the children in the same way that maybe a parent could, because it wasn't like, yeah,
Right.
even just from a sending them to their room or something like that.
Hmm.
And in terms of life, I probably had that idea of I'd have kids by my mid-20s, settle down, do all that sort of thing. But honestly, going and being a nanny with the young kids, I was like, I don't need kids for a very, very long time. And I know it sounds so silly, but I look back now and realize how valuable of a lesson that was to learn then, that, hey, I
Hmm.
have time and I am actually in no way, shape, or form ready to have children in the next, even call it 5 years, back when I
Hmm.
was 18. And it
Yeah.
just, once again, it kind of helped to separate out that idea of, my parents were married at 2021, they had kids by their mid-20s, the kind of more traditional
Right.
way of doing things. And I think it just went, oh, actually, I don't need to do that. I can go and live my life. And when I'm ready to have kids and look at doing that, then I can do that. But there is actually no way I want to do that right now. So I think that that's a really important piece. And even, so at the moment on this adult gap year that I'm on, so we've kind of been away for about 6 months from New Zealand, but we spent some time back with family in Australia. And we were in Japan and South Korea for 2 months, snowboarding and doing some other little things there.
Cool.
Basically, eating. The food was
Yeah.
phenomenal.
You do a lot of that when you're abroad, don't you?
That's pretty much all we did. But one thing that we set out with this gap year, and this is probably just another important piece to say, is that we set out very intentionally on this gap year. And I think that that's the difference between taking a gap year as opposed to just not really knowing what you're doing and trying the first thing when you leave school, because a gap year is
Right.
very intentional. And when we set out on this to do this gap year, I'm doing it with a partner, so there was kind of another like a different dynamic there. We had really two intentions, and one of them was to have fun, which I know sounds very like cliche, but this is what I live by. It's unserious careers. It's like, if I can't have fun, then what am I really doing?
Right.
So one of it was to have fun because we don't have kids, and that is potentially what that next phase is going to look like. So we don't have kids.
Right.
Let's go and have some fun. And we had to kind of specify that is one of the reasons why we're doing this. So like when we're feeling like, what are we doing? I have no idea what was the purpose behind all this. We can come back to that and go, you know what? We actually did set out to have fun. So are we having fun?
Right.
Yes, then that's
Yes.
great. But the second intention was to work out where we want to be located in the next phase of our life. And that could be for 2 years, that could be for longer. Is that going back to Australia? Is that moving to another country? Is it going back to New
Right.
Zealand? But we had that very clear intention before we set out. So as much as this year will be useful from a career perspective, we've actually kind of geared it to be more towards our life more than anything. And having even just spent those 2 months, I think, in Japan, South Korea, the amount of insight and clarity that we got for our lives and what we want to do next was just insane. And I think sometimes it takes stopping doing what you're currently doing to then open your mind up to what else is doing it, as opposed to going, well, I know I don't want this, so now how can I work out what that next thing is I can jump to? It's, well, how can I take that transition time to then open my mind up to what that next phase may be? So yeah, I think gap year is arguably more beneficial for your life than it is for your career.
Right. It's like the sabbatical for the normal person.
For sure.
And we all need that. We all need that time to just not be rushed. I love that you said that. Is we feel like, when we end something else, we have to be starting something new, and it's just expected out of us that you do that. But a lot of times we just aren't ready, and our kids aren't ready for that movement into something new right away, and that ability to try things out. You're not going to fail because you're just trying and you're just experiencing, and that's a beautiful place to be. and to have backing from other people in your life, like your parents, that say this is a good thing for you.
Yeah, and there's I don't know if this has been your experience with the parents that you work with, but I think I even think about the idea of, say, mindfulness and meditation, and that's very big at the moment, especially with mental health and trying to help people with that sort of stuff, post-pandemic, all the rest of it. But I think there's also something to be said for, you need to go through some of the hard times yourself. You can't be told about the hard times and what you need to do to avoid them by someone else. And I think even I know it as kind of a 30-year-old now, and it's like, someone might ask me, what do you wish you knew when you were 18? And I'm like, well, there were a whole bunch of things I could have known that could have avoided a bunch of wasted money, wasted time.
Yeah.
But I think when you try and put those ideas onto a person at 18, you're actually expecting too much from them. And
That's
I think this
true.
can kind of happen with that kind of pressure, maybe more of that helicopter parenting. It's like this drive to, but I don't want my child to have to go through the hardship I did, or I don't want my child to have to experience what I did. But if I just had have known this 10 years earlier, imagine how much further ahead I would be. But it's kind of like, I think you got to go, like, you got to relax. Like, as an 18-year-old, you have your whole life ahead of you, and you can't expect an 18-year-old to absorb every bit of information that a parent provides or school provides around how they can build a really great life or how they can avoid the mistakes they did. I think you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to try something, as opposed to just trying to have all the right answers and not make a wrong move. I think it's more through okay, this is not what I want because I don't like this job, or I haven't enjoyed this as much as I thought I did. That is more valuable often than trying to work out what you do want from the get-go. So we've got to kind of chill out a little bit and let a young person actually go through the same steps that a lot of us have gone through, that develop that grit and resiliency and that compassion.
Absolutely. And that ties so well into the conversation we had last week. I was talking to a woman who was talking about college admission essays, and she was saying it's storytelling, but that our students had to have a story to tell. And it was a story of what they overcame. And lots of times we coddle and we program the lives of our children so much that they don't overcome anything. And so here's this opportunity for this year that you could be giving your child a lot of ammunition for that college admission story of what they learned about themselves, what they were able to overcome. And it isn't just, it's something really life-changing that this gap year can be about.
It's I like to call it like voluntary hardship of okay, how do I explain this? So you hear a lot of stories, say, for example, of people that have overcome their hardships, or they've had trauma in their childhood, they've had these experiences, and now they've got these incredible stories where they've kind of come on the other side. And I think that there are a majority of people that don't have that big, like, it might be the death of a loved one, or it might be an accident or an illness or something like that that's happened in their childhood. A lot of people won't have an experience like that. They haven't gone through that. And I think this is where you can kind of go, you can admit that it's like, I've had it relatively easy. I mean, we all have our issues at high school, don't get me wrong, and there's bullying and all the rest of it. But I think for a lot of people, and especially if you are in a position, say, where you can go to university, you do have the resources, the support around you to be able to do that, there can sometimes be almost this feeling of like, but I don't have that story. I don't have anything, like I've had it pretty good. But this is where I think voluntary hardship is a really beautiful thing, where you can kind of volunteer to go and do something a little bit more difficult. And a really basic example I'm thinking of is, even my partner and I like to do it just with like minor things. It's nothing too major, but even we would have just share one car between us of like, yeah, it's not an extreme hardship, but what can that teach us about organization? About needing to be more prepared, about sometimes I'm not going to have that car available. So what am I going to do now? And it's such a really simple example. But even I think about my gap year, and when I left about 2 weeks after I'd graduated high school, and I had my backpack on, thought I knew everything. And my first stop was, I was flying into Los Angeles, and I was going to spend a few nights there before moving on again. And I thought I was so good. I booked my hostel. I knew exactly where I was staying. And then it's about a 16-hour flight from Melbourne to Los Angeles. And so it was like, I hadn't slept in so long. I arrived in Los Angeles airport at like 7 a.m. in the morning. And I was like, right, let's get to the hostel. And then I realized I had no idea how to get from the airport to the hostel. I had not even considered looking for directions before I left Australia. And keeping in mind, this is 12 years ago, so Google Maps wasn't really a thing.
Right, yeah.
Uber didn't exist. And so I had to like log on to a computer terminal at the airport in Los Angeles, find the directions, which bus I had to take. And I got on the bus, and I was so proud of myself. I was like, oh my God, I problem solved. I got on the bus. And then I got on the bus and realized I had no idea what stop to get off. I had no idea. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly.
It was a happy ending, and I spoke to a lovely local man, and he helped me. But it was one of those things of like, yes, it's not like a hardship as such. I appreciate the position that I'm in to be able to go and do this travel, but it was a challenge.
Yes.
And doing that alone taught me so much about myself. And it was like, right, Alana, you've got to get smart quickly, because guess what? It's all on you. You don't have your mum to be able to say, Mum, what's the weather going to be like today? What do I want to wear to school? Like, you've actually got to start thinking for yourself.
Absolutely. Yes. Those life lessons. And you do. You think you got it all together. My daughter took a trip, and we're on a very restricted diet, and she realized she couldn't almost eat all weekend because she didn't bring any food with her. And I always bring all the food. I always pack all of her food. And she's like, oh, I got to pack my own food. It's like, but yep, sometimes pain is the best teacher, and you do learn those lessons quickly.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about it, is that you can kind of create these environments where you are going to have these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us, our viewers, how to connect with you? I'm going to pull up your website to share on here, unserious-careers.com. What can they find on your website?
Yeah, so if you go to the website, I have it. The book is in ebook format, so you can jump on there, and if you're interested to purchase a book, it's very much filled with a lot of stories. It's funny you say about storytelling. So I think that that's the best way that I can kind of tell a story. To get a point across, is through stories. So it's really a lot of stories from my career and a lot of people that I know. And as I said, it's all around how in the first 5 years you can get a little bit less serious and more adventurous with your career. So it's written for a young person that is in that transition phase. But to be honest, I think a parent would get a lot out of it too, and then be able to kind of lead those discussions a little bit differently with their child. Otherwise, you can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok. So they're just both at Unserious Careers. And you can also, you can message me on Instagram, or else shoot me an email as well to hey@unseriouscareers.com. But I really love connecting with people. And if you have any questions or anything like that, please do let me know.
Awesome. Yes. And all of those links will be in the description of the podcast, as well as the YouTube video, so that you don't have to memorize all of that. And so you can just click on those links, and you can head there. Well, thank you, Alana. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm so glad that we talked about gap years. Like you said, I'm probably one of those few parents that are totally on board with this. I kind of tend to be a trendsetter. So I'm just excited that we're introducing more homeschool parents to this. And I know there's been a move. Homeschoolers tend to be in general a little more on the edge of educational choices. But I think a lot of times we have that pressure, that especially for those students that are doing well, and we don't see the advantage that this gap year can offer. So thank you for speaking into that, and sharing that experience, and for continuing to do what you do on your website and your podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. So make sure that you check out Alana's resources, especially if you're kind of going back and forth. Is a gap year something good for your students? I know we're talking about high school transitions, and so lots of choices to be made. And high school with a student can be sometimes a little bit anxiety producing, and a lot of parents are always looking for resources. So I know in the future of this video, we'll get a lot of views, as well as the podcast get a lot of listens, because it tends to be one of those that parents are like just clamoring for resources. How do we do this and make it good? Because that transition, we want to help our students, but I hopefully after listening to Alana, you realized it's not all up to you. So but yeah, just to recap, I think one of the biggest takeaways was that discussion with your student and that relationship, and also realizing that there's advantages far beyond just the experiences. I loved that ending discussion on hardships. That was powerful.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this broadcast. I've been kind of quiet today, but that's okay. I know sometimes we have conversations that bring up a lot more chat, and sometimes you just sit back and listen. So, but thank you for joining us live, and for watching on the recorded broadcast. The next broadcast, we're gonna wrap up our high school discussions, actually, and we're gonna talk about financial college planning strategies. So I know we talked a little bit about those finances, and Alana, we spoke some really good stuff into that about the student's responsibility too, and using that gap year for that as well. But we're gonna be talking to an expert that is gonna share some planning strategies for parents as well as children for those years ahead. So you'll want to join us for that. But thanks again, Alana. I appreciate you taking time, especially as you're on the road and traveling. And I know that's sometimes hard, but I'm glad your technology stayed together and we were able to finish the interview.
About that.
Oh no, it just happens. That's what happens when you're live. So absolutely. Well, take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time. And we'll, for the end of this month's theme. So we'll see you then. Take care, and God bless everyone. Bye.
This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations, provided by SPED Homeschool. Go to spedhomeschool.com to get resources and support for teaching your unique learner at home.